Hello everyone, Dr. John Bartemus here to discuss a topic tonight that is very near and dear to many parents' hearts out there, and that's the topic of a potential learning disability or focus and concentration issue in your child. Now, there are many children out there in the school system that are being labeled with learning disabilities and or ADD, ADHD that may not actually have them. My question is, do these children actually have a diagnosable condition, or are they a nuisance to the school system and or the teacher, so they're being pushed down a certain path so that the school can deal with them more efficiently, and maybe their scores and all of those things won't be affected, and therefore their money from the state won't be affected. Either way, whether there's a financial interest behind it or not, what we need to determine is, do these children truly have a condition or not? So in order to assess these children the right way, I believe a paradigm shift is needed. And that paradigm shift is one of moving from looking at these children as if they have broken brains to moving to an understanding of neurology and development, and understanding that we have a right brain and a left brain. And the right brain deals with art and big picture and music and emotions and creativity and pretending and dream world and that sort of thing. And the left brain deals with math and logic and reading comprehension and language and linearity and analytics. So school, you can see, is mostly a left brain exercise. And so if you have a child who is more right brain bias early on in school or throughout school at any point, then they tend to be the kids who are labeled with learning disabilities and or attention deficit issues, because they are more viewed as the free spirits or the artsy kids or whatever. And so what we need to understand is neither is wrong, and as a child develops, the brain will flip-flop between sides of dominance or bias as they go through development. So instead of labeling these children as learning disabled or ADD, ADHD, maybe we need to understand that not all brains and all children develop at the same rate. So just because a child's in a certain grade and they should be up to this certain standard, that standard is set as a population standard, or all children in general in that grade should perform at this level. But when you dial into a specific child, if they're not performing to that level, that doesn't necessarily mean they're behind. Behind neurologically, it may just mean that they're developing at a different rate than what the school requires for that for that grade. I hope this is making sense. So rather than labeling them, we need to understand each child and where they're at and support them in that way. And so how do we do that? Well, functional neurology looks at functional deficits in the brain, meaning maybe an area of the brain is developing at a slower rate, or maybe the child's neurodevelopment was slowed because they didn't crawl long enough before they walked, or they have vision issues, or maybe they're too sedentary or something of this nature. So there are certain things you can do through a functional neurologic rehab perspective that can help bring the brain area that's lagging behind up to speed. So for example, if the child is struggling with math, we know that's a left brain function. So we can work to rehab the left brain through certain body movements or certain eye movements, certain vestibular systems. So instead of labeling them with a learning disability, we could examine them and say, hey, maybe certain sensory systems or certain primitive reflexes or certain other things are present or absent that need to be remediated or rehabbed so that that system turns back on and integrates properly. And so to help make the picture more clear for you, the brain is an accumulation of individual cells called neurons. The neurons all speak to each other. And so to have a thought or to learn something or to create a movement, it has to move. The thought would be portrayed in this image as one of the light bursts here. And so you have the thought or the movement or the image. the action potential has to move down the neuron through the synapse to the next neuron and be propagated neuron to neuron to neuron until the thought or movement occurs. If the individual neurons or brain cells are not integrating properly, you don't have the thought or the movement, or you don't learn whatever it is you're learning at that time. So functional neurologists specialize in these deficits. Mainstream neurologists specialize in tumor, fracture, hemorrhage, true CNS diseases, those sorts of things. So a functional neurologist will look at the neuron and say, hey buddy, why aren't you working? Why aren't you integrating with your other buddies? And why isn't this part of the brain as a whole integrating with the rest of the brain to create learning in this instance? So functional neurologists know that there may be a brain deficit, or the brain may be fine and there may be an issue metabolically or somewhere else in life that is impacting the brain. For example, if a child was born through C-section, then they probably didn't get the flora they needed to seed their immune system by passing through the vaginal canal of the mother, so their immune system didn't develop properly, and that may lead to neuroinflammation, which impacts brain function in a negative way. Or if the child was not breastfed, they didn't get the DHA from the omega-3 fatty acids from the breast milk that they needed for the brain to develop properly, maybe. Or maybe the US vaccine schedule created neuroinflammation in that person's brain, which again leads to suboptimal brain development potentially and brain integration. And there's lots of studies showing that vaccines can cause brain inflammation. Maybe this child has had multiple colds and has been sick throughout their life. Well, there's multiple infectious diseases or pathogens that have been connected to neuroinflammatory diseases. A perfect example of one that's grown in incidence lately is called PANDAS or PANS, and that's a neurologic disorder associated with strep infection. So maybe the person's not learning well because they've got a neurologic disorder caused by having chronic colds. Diet can impact learning. If your child's choosing the apple over the donut, or you're allowing your child, if your child's choosing the donut over the apple, or you're allowing your child to choose the donut over the apple each day, then imagine what's happening to them. They eat the donut, they get a blood sugar spike, and by probably 9 or 10 a.m. at school, their blood sugar's crashed, and they can no longer focus. If they can't focus, they're not going to perform well in school, and they may act out, and then they may be labeled as a behavior kid or a lack of concentration kid, an ADD, ADHD kid. So nutrition plays a big role in brain function because the brain needs fuel and activation to perform properly. So fuel would be sugar, glucose, and oxygen, and activation would be exercise. So if our children are not exercising, the brain is not getting the nutrient, one of the key nutrients it needs, that being movement, exercise, to grow and develop properly. If you're not moving, you're not going to learn optimally. Well, what are our schools doing? They're removing gym class, they're removing recess, they're removing the movement from school and taking these monkeys and putting them in a cage for 6 to 8 hours a day without letting them move. Of course they're going to act out. Of course they're going to get burned out on cramming math and reading into their brain if they're not allowed to go move and express themselves. And then lastly, what are we role modeling as parents? If we're role modeling sitting on the couch and eating Cheetos to our kids, that's what our kids are going to do. If we're role modeling sitting on the couch and eating, our brains are deteriorating. If our kids are doing that, their brains aren't developing. So we need to look at these children not as broken brains, but from a whole life perspective and say, how many different contributing factors are possibly present in this child that could be contributing to their quote-unquote learning disability or ADD, ADHD, and then one by one address those things. And as we address them, observe and track how does this child's performance in school change. Does it improve? And if so, then we know, hey, this isn't necessarily a diagnosable condition, but it was a functional neurologic deficit or a metabolic deficit caused by lifestyle issues. So if you're asking yourself, well, who does this? Who can I bring my child to? Functional medicine practitioners do this. Functional medicine practitioners with functional neurology training will do this even better. So that is what we do at Functional Medicine Charlotte and have been trained to do. And so we welcome you into the practice and would love to speak to you about your child and the possibility of it maybe being a good fit. Have a great day.